Welcome to She Sells Radio. So I'm so excited to share today's interview with you because when I look back on my own journey of growing my business and my revenue and my income, and really even beyond that, just having deeper levels of peace and contentment and confidence than I experienced most of my life, one of the things that really contributed to it was being authentic, radically authentic. And I know that word gets thrown around so much. And you may be listening to this and saying, okay, Elyse, I'm over the authenticity conversation. But I will say, if you are saying that, there's a high likelihood that there's part of you that's afraid to be vulnerable. There's part of you that's afraid to be real and authentic. And my guest today on the podcast is going to share with you, how can you leverage authenticity as your superpower? How can you use it to be the one thing that elevates your career, whether it's in corporate, whether you're running your own business? And so I'm so excited for this conversation. My guest today is Erin Hatzikostas, and I feel like I always butcher her name. So Erin, if you're listening, which I'm sure you are at some point, fingers crossed that I didn't butcher it that time. But she's such a badass. This woman is incredible. I'm just going to share with you part of her bio, just so you can get a sense of who she is and who you're learning from. So Erin is a CEO. She's a best-selling author. She's a TEDx speaker, a career coach, a podcast co-host. And when she was 42, listen to this. This is wild. I can't even imagine this. So when she's 42, she becomes the CEO of a 9-figure company. Yeah, like no pressure, right? She goes on to triple earnings in 3 years and send employee engagement skyrocketing. She actually talks about in the podcast today how being authentic was what she attributed most to her success there. It wasn't some corporate strategy, it wasn't some coach she hired, but it was her being her, which is so powerful to me. And so she actually got to a point where she realized how powerful that authenticity was and decided to leave that, dream career that most people would pray for and dream for and go and create her own company, Be Authentic Inc. And she's written an amazing book. She's coaching people across the world on how to use authenticity as their superpower to get the results they're looking for in their career. And I wanted to have her on today to talk about how we can leverage authenticity, whether you're in sales, whether you're an independent contractor, whether you're, running your own show, maybe you're the CEO of an 8 or 9-figure business yourself, right? So Erin shares so much value today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to her, but definitely just listen to this one with the question in mind of, in what ways can I deepen and strengthen the ways in which I'm showing up either authentically or inauthentically, right? How can I deepen my authenticity, my vulnerability in how I show up, and listen for that one thing that's going to help you do it. And it's going to be game changing for you. So with that, let's welcome Erin to She Sells Radio. Erin, I'm so excited to have you on She Sells Radio. And in the spirit of kind of how we were talking in the pre-chat about just letting things flow and not being too committed to the outcome, which seems to be a message for both of us today, as well as just from the universe in general. I'm excited to just see where this conversation goes about your new book and about authenticity. So welcome, and just beyond thrilled to have you here on the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Elyse. I'm super excited to see you. It's been a while since we got to be together. So it's great to at least be here and sort of 3D-ish land.
Ish. Which is appropriate for you do you-ish. So I'm really excited to just to dive into more of what you talk about in your book. But I love this topic because I think I struggled for so many years with being authentic, and I would blow it off too. I was like, that's like, who needs that? Who needs vulnerability? Who needs authenticity? Like, I just need a better sales closing script and I'm going to hit my numbers and be fine. And I had such a wall up because I was really insecure. Mm-hmm. And so I'm excited about this because my guess is if someone's listening, they're either kind of on that journey or they're like a little more evolved than I was, and they're excited to find out how to be more authentic. So how did this become a topic that you're passionate about? How did this even become like your life's work, or at least your life's work right now?
Yeah, it's so interesting. So I spent my first 22 years in the corporate world. My last 3, I was running a corporate subsidiary of a larger Fortune 50 company. And had tremendous success, sort of stepped into the big girl role with a mess. The company was really struggling financially, culturally. And after 3 years, we tripled earnings and our engagement scores went up 12 percentage points, I think, in just 2 years. And just kind of when I was at my best, I had this itch to go do something new. And, you know, the story about authenticity, though, came when I went to leave. So authenticity is a word, of course, I had heard, but when I announced technically it was a retirement, the single most common thread through the emails, the calls, was, we'll miss your authentic leadership. And I remember having this moment where I literally was like, was it really that? Was it that easy? Because I had moments in my career, I worked hard. I mean, I don't want to be annoying and be like, it was so easy, but I had many moments as I was rising up each ladder. You know, you tend to be conditioned like, oh, I'm going to go to the next level, which also means I have to compromise more. I have to sacrifice more, right? Like, whether it was seeing colleagues move their families for jobs, or people being on a plane, you know, 3 or 4 weeks out of the year, or, you know, colleagues that like had to cancel vacations because something blew up and they were the big boss and they had to be there. And I didn't feel like I had to do that as much. And so when people said, I'm going to miss your authentic leadership, it was like this light bulb moment, as cliche as that sounds, where I was like, oh, and then I started to think about, okay, was I just being myself? And I thought, well, not necessarily. Like, I wasn't acting like I would if you invited me to a pool party, right? Like, I wasn't just walking in with this uninhibited, free-willing attitude. I knew that not just for me, but also for when you see somebody that's authentic, like, you know it, right? You're just like, there's like this, this exhale, and you're like, they're so authentic. But I knew that it was more than just being yourself. And so, you know, I started to get excited about authenticity, like, oh, okay, that fueled, like, let's get more of that. And a lot of that was fueled by like, oh, the workplace has so much BS and like so much rigmarole. And I proved as an executive, like, I wasn't just some worker bee that was like screaming and crying about the BS at work. I proved that you could have success and get rid of, maybe not all, but a lot of that. And so I just became on this voyage to say, okay, I want to solve what pisses me off, what breaks my heart, which is this lack of authenticity in the workplace. And B, by doing that, I want to help people do what I did, which is not just be like myself, but I realized that, like, I had used authenticity as my secret weapon. I had actually, without really knowing it, used authenticity as the way to connect better with people, to stand out in meetings, right? Like, I would go into certain meetings with executives, I would tell a story at the beginning and people would be like, who's this chick, right? Like, who is this person? Or I would expose a flaw of mine that people wouldn't expect. And when I realized that I was actually not just giving myself a permission, but using it as my success, I realized that I was like literally put on this earth to go out and preach about authenticity and its power in the workplace.
Well, it's so true. And I even think about, you know, one of the women in my group program was talking about how she's learned to be so vulnerable in front of her team members and her employees, and how they actually appreciate it when she shares, like, hey, this is something I'm going through right now, or actually I don't know the answer. Is there a balance, especially when, so I think about, like, most of the people listening probably care somewhat about their social media presence, possibly not, but a lot of them are either in sales or, you know, entrepreneurs, and they're putting themselves out there on social media. Is there a balance where it's too much and where you're like overexposing, or is there not? Like, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is authenticity does not equal transparency. And I think when I get that question, which I often get, you know, authenticity doesn't mean that I would go into an all-employee town hall and be like, well, just, you know, last night, you know, after I got done like snuggling up with my husband, I laid awake, you know, worried about how our systems might collapse because we haven't invested enough in, you know, in the scalability. Like, authenticity is not a synonym for transparency. So that's number one. So I think the most important part is when people ask that, I say, let's really define what authenticity is. And that's the first thing I do in my book. When I had that epiphany that, okay, there's something more nuanced and more complex about me that is goes beyond being yourself. I started to look into, okay, well, first of all, what's the root of the word? So the root, the Greek root word is authentikos.
Mm.
And authentikos means to be genuine, but it also means to be original and authoritative. And so the first thing I always say, authenticity is like this combo of you being yourself, but also being badass.
Mm.
And so when I saw that, I thought, aha, okay, thesis number one, authenticity, and what makes it so powerful isn't simply being yourself. And so once I had that permission that, okay, it's more nuanced, I thought, how do let me dissect myself, let me dissect others, and what is it then that really makes us go, oh, you're so authentic? And so I actually ended up coming up with a framework called the 6 Principles of Strategic Authenticity. And it's grounded by an acronym HUMANS. Mm. And the words that I really get people to gravitate around and understand what authenticity really is are grounded by humility, being unexpected, modeling. So sort of like, shut up and show up, so stop talking and show what you want. Adapting, and there's actually 2 components to adapting. Narrating, so storytelling, and sparking. And so once you start to buy into, and of course with the book, I'm pretty sure I convince people, right? I hammer home this business case that it isn't transparency. It isn't simply being yourself, that it is more nuanced, which means it's also more powerful. Then the answer to your question, is there ever too much? I would say no.
Interesting. So yeah, it's that confusion of what it actually is. So that makes a ton of sense. What holds us back from being authentic? Is it insecurity? Like I felt like it was for me. Is it something else? Like, what do you see holding people back from really stepping into that?
Yeah, I think for most people, we model the behavior we've seen before us.
Yeah.
So let me start in the kind of the corporate world, which to me is the most troubled from an authenticity perspective. Yeah. Corporate, government, you can sort of, the non-entrepreneurial world. And we emulate, just like our kids, right? Like, how do they learn to walk? We don't sit down and tell them, drop, the steps. They watch us, right? And the same thing happens as we become adults. And so, for example, in the corporate world, we see those people before us that have the bigger jobs, and this is how they do it, right? When they come to a meeting, they're a little more stuffy, or they always have their headshot in the top of their communications, or they don't necessarily aren't vulnerable, authentic, etc. And why are they like that? Well, because there's other people before us, right? Like I sort of say we're caught in like this vortex of like just kind of following the path of others because it feels safe, or what we think is safe. And so, that's what holds us back. The question is, how do you get over that if you don't have, so for example, when I was the CEO of the subsidiary company, I had a boss. She was an SVP. It was a woman, actually. Elyse, she was not authentic. So I can't say, when I did some of the things that were more authentically Erin, like it was, let me tell you, it was very, very different than my boss. It was very against the grain. But what I teach is it's really about experiments. And here's one of the most important things. Well, there's 2. One, it's actually not about you. Authenticity is about how can you better connect with other people. And so the principles of authenticity really get people to go, oh, they're like me. Or, oh, they're imperfect. Or, oh, I see what they're doing, I'm going to follow. Or, oh, they've inspired me. So that's the first thing. Like it's less about you. It eventually becomes about you because you get to have you get to connect with people and have success, and then also not be, this rigid, stuffy person. But it's also incredibly contagious. So authenticity. So because it's essentially doing the things that most of us have like hidden inside of us, unlocked inside of us. I'll give you the simplest of examples. Like this is like basic. your out of office message. So especially in corporate world, I had for 20 years been saying the same freaking, like, I will be out of the office. If you have any issues,
Yep.
I will be slow to respond, right? Like all that crap. Like,
Yep.
if you have any issues, like contact, my assistant and blah, 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 blah. And if it's an emergency, and one day I was like, why am I doing? A, that's boring.
Yeah.
B, I also was like, okay, this goes out to hundreds of people a day. Like, I'm missing an opportunity, right? Like to inspire, to connect, like a bazillion of people are getting these emails because I would get so many emails a day. And I remember changing it. It was, just a simple experiment. We're going to Vermont, nothing risky. I was like, hey, we're heading up to Vermont for a long weekend. I'll get back to you when I'm, well rested and less cranky. And you just, like I always say, authenticity is like you have like a half a glass of wine talking to your like best colleague friend.
I love that.
And nobody said something specifically, but I started to notice, because at that time I was the CEO, like I started to notice the out of offices of everybody just starting to like be a little less, rigid and edgy. And so the thing about authenticity is it when you start to do it, you like unlock this power that's inside of you, but also inside of others, because it's not a technique. It's not a discipline. It's for most people, it's like, oh my gosh, I've been wanting to do that. That's so refreshing. I've been wanting, my LinkedIn has been so stuffy, or I'm so sick of coming to meetings with like the same opening, like, here's the agenda and who's on the thing and blah, blah, blah. Like, oh my gosh, they started with a story that was so refreshing. I'm going to try it. And so I think the way we fight this vortex that we're in, which to your question is why we're so afraid of it, is really about little experiments. And they don't have to start the grand poopah. Like, they don't have to be the CEO like I was. Those experiments can start at any level and start to just ignite these fires throughout. And what happens is when you do those experiments and you start to see, like, for example, let's say you tell a story at the beginning of a meeting and you see people who are normally like on their phones and like not listening, start to lean in, because you're going to get addicted to it. You're going to get addicted. And I always say, I don't change people. I just change their addictions. And so it's really about just little experiments to start to set the stage and get us out of that vortex. And the more we can start to do it from all directions, eventually that's what they call a movement.
Are there any nuances that you see for women specifically when it comes to authenticity, like anything that's either more challenging or easier, or anything to just that you've seen and experienced since you've been a woman in such high leadership positions?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, I always say, because people are like, oh, are you a women's only? I'm like, no, I say authenticity is gender neutral, advantage women. Meaning I have my theory about the reason why we have this big gender inequality issue. And this is what I talk about on the TED, when I did my TEDx this fall. I say, it's a little controversial, but it isn't necessarily because women are being held down. It's actually that we're opting down. And why are we opting down? And that's different than opting out. I mean, some are, but I almost opted down. I was offered the COO position before the CEO position. And I said, no, thank you at first. And I talk about this in my TEDx, when I thought about it over the weekend, I finally thought, okay, what am I afraid of? And I wasn't what people think is confidence. And for some it is, but I was not actually afraid of not being able to do the job. I was afraid of having to kind of enter this club, this mold that I didn't want to be. And like I say in my TED talk, in this club, I worried that things like my ego would grow and my calendar would overflow and my home life would become a shit show and my personality might even start to blow. And so I think for us women, this fear of compromise, whether it's our soul, kind of like I'm talking about there, or time with our family, or time away from, like, if I take that bigger job, am I not going to be able to train for the half marathon that I've been on track, so that my health is going to go to shit. And when you start to empower authenticity as a way of being, to me, that cuts through so much of that fear of compromise. It allows you to say, hey, like, I am not, I can't go on this business trip because, I promised my son that I'd be at his, recorder concert. It allows us to, and that plane trip that you were going to take as a woman, that maybe you didn't get that deal as easily, but now you're also going to have 10 times more employees that want to come work for you because they're like, I want to work for that chick that sometimes says no to the business trip because of their kids, recorder class. Yeah. So, for me, the practice and the living in a world that really embraces, not just allows authenticity, but recognizes it as a superpower and a secret weapon, I think is the single biggest thing that's going to help us with our gender equality issue.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. And I would definitely encourage everyone to go check out your TEDx talk. I'm curious, just as we start to wrap up here, because I love this topic and I think there's so many applications, but a lot of my listeners are in sales too. And so for someone I love the story about the autoresponder and how people just started to lighten up a little bit when you did that. And I know when I was in corporate, I felt like I had to fit into such a mold and I had to be a certain way and show up a certain way to be liked and be successful. Are there any other tips or things that you would give to women, specifically women in sales, for how to bring in more authenticity to help them with their sales process? Because they may be feeling like, I have to follow this exact script. I have to say this. I have to do this exactly this way because this is what I'm being taught by leadership. And they feel boxed in and like they're not really themselves, but they may feel afraid to be themselves. So obviously you shared great advice earlier they can implement, but is there anything else specific to sales that you think would be important to know?
Yeah, so interesting. I just gave a virtual keynote a couple of weeks ago to a group of about 300 salespeople for a large healthcare company, and they just ate it up. And I would say of the 6 principles that I preach, the biggest one is the narration or the storytelling. I actually tell a funny story in the book. It's funnier in my keynotes because I show the video. So you remember the movie Tommy Boy with Chris Farley?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And most people, right, you remember the laughs more than the lesson, as I say, right? Like it's hilarious. But I always talk about my father actually was a huge storyteller, but the man that really taught me the power of storytelling and sales was Tommy Boy. And there's a great scene. It's one of the epic scenes. There's so many of them, but where, he had gotten hit in the face. And they're at the diner and he's like, do I have something on my face that hurts? And, but then that's the funny part of the story at first, but then he goes on to say look, Richard, here's why I suck as a salesperson. And he goes on this rant about how he gets all uptight and he's like, and I get my little customer and he's got this role and I pet it and I love it and I nurture it. And then he rips it up. It's hilarious. And he's telling this whole story to a waitress. And this waitress was the same waitress that he had asked a minute earlier, can I get some wings? And she's like, the kitchen's closed. We're in between shifts, kitchen's closed. And so he tells this whole story about selling and he gets done telling it. And Helen, the waitress, goes, you know what? And first she says, you're pretty disturbed. And then she says, I'm going to go throw those wings in for you. And that was Tommy's light bulb moment. If you remember when he was going on his tour to sell the Callahan brake pads, at first he was trying to sell through the traditional, right? We have guarantees and da-da-da. And when he finally realized the power of storytelling, of understanding what their customers want, remember, and then he starts to turn it around, right? He starts to go to all these meetings and telling stories about his family and the tradition of the Callahan auto parts. And, I think storytelling is so powerful. Actually, I think it's the largest chapter when I talk about the humans framework. I walk through not just the power of storytelling, but the myths around it, and then the types of stories that you can tell, and how to start crafting just this constant library of stories, whether they're short, little verbal tweets or metaphors, all the way to telling more powerful stories that help the customers understand the experience they'll have with your company, to the more metaphorical, what's your purpose, your passion, and a story that really highlights why you care so much about the product you're trying to sell. So yeah, to me, authenticity is 1,000% fits into a strategy for a salesperson. And then the storytelling component, to me, I always say, I was never in sales, but I was sold to 1 million times as a CEO. And so I know what works for me. And, If I were in sales, I would spend not just time telling stories, but I also talk about the most powerful story is just mining for your customer success stories, not testimonials. Those are powerful, but the actual, like, if you have a customer service team, I would cozy up with those people and be like, tell me some stories. There is gold sitting in the ears of your customer service team and your people on the front lines, or even yourself if you're a smaller entrepreneur. Tell those stories.
That's so good. Yeah, that's so good. Oh my gosh. So if a woman is listening, so I want to ask your one final piece of advice, and then I want you to tell everyone where they can get your book and where they can connect more with you, Erin. So a lot of the women who listen to this show, they're like working to break through their first 6 figures and they're really excited about it. And that's like, they want to do more, but that's the first target. So if you were going to give one piece of advice to a woman who was wanting to break through 6 figures this year, what would that be for her?
Oh, it'd be my 50% rule. It would be my 50% rule, which I touch on just a tiny bit in the book. It may be the book number 2, but here's what it is, what I mean by that. I experienced it too. So I was this trailblazer, right? I had this corporate career and I was doing everything my own way. And then I became an entrepreneur 2 years ago. And I joined great masterminds like Brand Builders Group and others, right? Which taught me such amazing things. I had coaches, all those things. And then, I looked up after like a year of just like exhaustion and not feeling like I could do it. And I really like, why is this so hard for me? Like there was definitely a huge friction point for me and executing. I knew it wasn't, I have a lot of, like I work hard. It wasn't about me being lazy. And I realized that the moments when I hit the biggest walls, and I talk about this right in the beginning of the book, I hit it with my book, is when I realized I'm working hard to on the things I should do. And it's not all shoulds. It's the shoulds where I'm like, that doesn't quite feel right to me. Or if I were on the other side of this, I wouldn't like that, right? And so the 50% rule is essentially something that guides me all the time, which means learn from Elyse, learn from others, take 50% and don't be stupid. Like they have great advice. They've seen things ahead of you. They have good techniques. Take half of it. Yeah. But give yourself permission to fill in the other half your own way. It's okay to sometimes just something that doesn't feel right, or you think it won't resonate, or you have a better idea. That's how we innovate. That's how we evolve. That's how we're authentic. I mean, authenticity isn't all about just being your own self, but if you can sort of have a mix of roughly 50% sort of what you've learned, but then 50% doing it your own freaking way, it's probably one of the most freeing things. And thank you, because you're going to be innovating and showing a new path for all of us instead of just following the lead.
That's so good, Erin. And I wish, like my younger self, I wish I knew that it was okay to trust myself, and that just because my idea was different from someone who was more experienced than me or making more money than me, or they were on the New York Times list and I wasn't, like that still doesn't make me wrong if I have a different idea. So thank you for sharing that. So please tell everyone where they can get the book, where they can find out more, where they can connect with you, all the things I know they're going to want to know.
Yeah. Well, so in the book, I call myself an instant gratification whore, which I know is really, it's really dirty, but that like an IGW. If you're an IGW, you can go straight to Amazon and get my book. It's called You Do You-ish. Unleash Your Authentic Superpowers to get the career you deserve. But also the best hub is my website. You can go to beauthenticinc.com. It's just the letter B, authenticinc.com. So it's a great hub for my podcast, book, blog, all the things. And I have a great fun little quiz on there where you can find your superpower. You can find out if you're like a bashful badass or if you're a practical powerhouse. You can take that there. And then on the socials, if we want to hang out in 3D-ish, as I call it, I'm most active on LinkedIn and Instagram, both under my name. I'm the only Erin Hatzikostas in the world. So if you can spell it, you can find me.
Well, that's very appropriate for having a brand about authenticity. So that's awesome. And Erin, I think, if we can all take away just the freedom and permission to be ourselves and to show up in the most powerful version of ourselves too, then it's what else is there, right? So this was really, really powerful. Thank you so much for your time, for writing this incredible book. We're so grateful for you. And I love you, sister. Thank you
Thank
again.
you. Love you too.